Roy Hadley rode into the Cimarron Valley on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883 with nothing but a worn saddle, a bay horse named Copper, and a scar that ran from his left temple down across his cheekbone to the corner of his jaw like a river carved into stone by decades of relentless water. He had heard there was work in the valley. Good ranching country, someone had told him in a saloon in Amarillo, 3 weeks and 200 miles back. Plenty of outfits looking for experienced hands. The grass runs long and the cattle are fat, and a man who knows his trade can find himself a steady wage, and a bunk and maybe something like a life worth living. Roy knew his trade. He had been working cattle since he was 16 years old, had ridden the Great Kishom Trail twice, had broken horses and mended fences, and read the sky for weather with the kind of certainty that only comes from years of living directly beneath it. He was 31 now, and his body carried the knowledge of all those years in the way good leather carries its age, tough and supple and honest. But nobody ever saw his body first. They saw his face. The scar had come from a branding iron. Not by accident. When Roy was 22 and working for a cattleman named Dorset in the Texas Panhandle, he had stepped between that man and a Mexican vaquero named Esteban who had made the mistake of asking for his promised wages. Dorset had swung the iron without thinking, or perhaps with too much thinking, and Roy had been close enough that the hot metal had kissed his face before he could pull back. Esteban had gotten away. Roy had gotten the scar and his walking papers, both delivered the same afternoon. He did not regret it. Not once in 9 years had he regretted standing between a powerful man and a defenseless one. But he had learned something in those 9 years that he could not have understood at 22. He had learned that the world read a man's face before it read his soul, and that a man with a face like his would always be asking the world for patience it did not naturally possess. The first ranch he came to on the eastern edge of the Cimarron Valley was called the Double Horn, and the man who ran it came out onto his porch and watched Roy ride up with the flat expression of someone who had already made up his mind. "Looking for work," Roy said. He kept his voice even, the way he had learned to do it. Not pleading, not aggressive, just clear. The rancher looked at him for a long moment. He had a heavy face and small eyes and the kind of mustache that men grew when they wanted people to take them seriously. "Got all the hands I need," he said. "I can work any position you got open. Riding, roping, breaking, mending fence, I have done it all. I have 2 full trail drives behind me and 9 years of steady ranch work." Said I got all the hands I need. Roy held the man's gaze for a moment. He had ridden 40 miles that day and his back ached and Copper needed water, but he kept his voice level. "Much obliged for your time," he said, and turned Copper back toward the road. The second ranch was called the Broken Wheel, and the foreman there at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. He was a younger man, sandy-haired, and he looked at Roy's scar with wide eyes that he tried to narrow so they would not be so obviously wide. "We are running a full crew," he said, "but I will take your name in case something opens up." Roy knew nothing would open up. He gave his name anyway because it cost him nothing. The third ranch was the biggest in the valley, a spread called the Rocking K that covered several thousand acres and ran 300 head of cattle. The owner, a man named Gerald Kessler, came out to speak to Roy personally. He was silver-haired and prosperous and wore his wealth in the cut of his vest and the shine of his boots. He looked at Roy's face for a long time without any pretense of not looking at it. "What happened to you?" he asked. "Branding iron," Roy said. 9 years ago. How? I got between a man and something he wanted to do that was wrong." Kessler studied him with those careful silver eyes. "You have references?" "I do. Foreman named Bill Tarrant at the Circle R outside of Amarillo. A man named Hodges at the Lazy S in the Texas Panhandle. I can write you their names and where to send a wire." Kessler was quiet for a moment. Roy thought for a brief, bright instant that this might be the one. That this silver-haired man with his prosperous vest and his 300 head of cattle might be the one who looked past the landscape of his face to the competence and honesty that lived behind it. "I run a lot of cattle and I need steady, capable men," Kessler said. But I also deal with buyers from Kansas City and Denver, and I bring them out to the ranch, and the impression my crew makes matters to me. I am sorry. It is not personal." It was entirely personal, Roy thought. The most personal thing there was. But he said nothing. He touched the brim of his hat and turned Copper around and rode back down the long straight road that cut through the lush green valley. He had stopped at 3 ranches. He rode to 2 more that afternoon, a small outfit called the Bar 4 and a mid-sized spread run by a man named Weston who had more cattle than sense. Both turned him away within moments of seeing him. The Bar 4 man did not even let him speak. Weston at least listened to the first sentence before he shook his head. By the time the sun was pulling itself toward the western hills, Roy Hadley had been turned away from 5 ranches in the Cimarron Valley, and the weight of it was sitting on him the way heavy weather sits on open ground, pressing down without apology. He found a creek and let Copper drink. He filled his own canteen and sat on a flat rock and chewed a piece of dried beef that had seen better days and thought about the road ahead. There was supposed to be a small town about 3 miles east, a place called Mercy Creek. He could resupply there, sleep in a real bed if the hotel was cheap enough, and then figure out his next step. Maybe the valley had not shown him everything. Maybe there were smaller outfits further back in the hills that he had not found yet. He was not a man who gave easily into despair. He had been discouraged before and had ridden through it the way you ride through a long stretch of bad country, keeping your eyes on the horizon and trusting that the ground would eventually improve. But tonight, sitting by that creek in the last of the spring light, with the distant hills going purple and the sound of water moving over stones and not a single door in this entire valley open to him, he felt something that was less than despair but more than tiredness. He felt the specific loneliness of a man who has made himself useful and honest and capable, and still finds the world unwilling to know it. He rode into Mercy Creek as the lamps were being lit. It was a small town, the kind that the frontier produced in those years with a kind of careless abundance, a main street with a general store and a saloon and a livery, and a hotel that advertised rooms for 25 cents a night. There was a church at the far end with a steeple that needed painting, and a small school, and 3 or 4 residential streets going off to either side. Roy put Copper up at the livery and paid for oats and a good brushing, and then walked to the hotel, carrying his saddlebag over one shoulder. The man at the desk took his money and handed him a key without looking up, and Roy climbed the stairs to a small room with a window that faced the alley and a bed that was narrow but clean, and lay down on top of the quilt with his boots on, and stared at the ceiling. He thought about a man named Cole Danvers who had told him in Amarillo that the Cimarron Valley was good country for a man looking for work. Cole Danvers had never been to the Cimarron Valley. Roy understood now. Cole Danvers had simply been the kind of man who said things with confidence that he had no particular reason to be confident about. Roy closed his eyes. He would figure out tomorrow in the morning. In the morning, he went to the general store to buy supplies, and that was where he first heard about the Lawson place. He was standing at the counter waiting for the storekeeper, a round man named Abernathy, to wrap up a side of salt pork when 2 men at the end of the counter started talking in the way that men talk in small stores when they are not particularly concerned about who hears them. "You hear Lawson's widow is still trying to run that place herself," the first man said. He had a hat with a wide brim and the permanent squint of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. "I heard," the second man said, "cannot last." George Lawson ran that ranch on the strength of his own 2 hands and half a dozen good men. She has been losing hands steady for the past 6 months. Heard she was down to 2. Woman alone up there with 2 hands and a half-dead ranch. She ought to sell to Kessler and be done with it. Kessler has been after that land for years. The Lawson place sits right up against the North Range, and Kessler wants the water rights that come with it. George Lawson told him no every time he asked. Well, George Lawson is in the ground now, and the widow is going to have to make a practical decision sooner or later. Abernathy came back with the salt pork and Roy paid and left, but the conversation stayed with him. He stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the general store with his saddlebag and thought about it. A ranch with a shortage of hands. A woman trying to hold on to something. He did not know if she would be any different from the 5 men who had turned him away yesterday, but the simple mathematics of a place that needed workers and a man who needed work seemed worth at least the price of a ride. He asked Abernathy for directions before he left town. The storekeeper told him the Lawson Ranch was about 6 miles north, up into the foothills, and that the road turned to a rough track past the old mill pond, but it was passable if he took it slow. He took it slow. The land changed as he rode north. The flat valley floor gave way to rolling ground, and then the rolling ground gave way to steeper hillsides covered in juniper and pinon pine, and the air was cooler and sharper and smelled like cedar and creek water. It was beautiful country in a way that the well-tended valley ranches were not quite beautiful, in the way that wildness is always more beautiful than cultivation, even though cultivation is what keeps a person fed. The Lawson Ranch house appeared as he came around a long curve in the track, sitting in a natural hollow between 2 hills with a creek running about 100 yards to the east. It was a solid house, built from local stone and timber, with a wide porch and a real glass window on the front. The barn behind it was large and well constructed, though one of the corral fence boards was down and had not been put back up. There were 2 men working near the barn who stopped to look at him as he rode in. And then there was a woman. She came out of the barn door while he was still 10 yards off, and she had a pitchfork in one hand and a look on her face that said she was not in the mood for anything that was going to waste her time. She was tall for a woman, with dark hair pulled back under a plain hat, and she was dressed in a practical cotton shirt and working trousers tucked into worn boots. She looked to be around 28 or 29. Her face was the kind of face that does not announce itself immediately but rewards looking at it, strong-boned and honest, with dark eyes that were currently measuring him the way a skilled carpenter measures a board. She looked at him, not at his scar, but at him. Her eyes moved across his face the way they moved across the rest of him, taking inventory. What she was inventorying he could not have said exactly, but it was not horror and it was not pity and it was not the careful blankness of someone trying to pretend they had not noticed. "Rebecca Lawson," he said. "That is right," she said. "Roy Hadley. I am looking for ranch work. I heard you might be short-handed." She set the pitchfork against the barn door frame and put her hands on her hips. The 2 men near the barn were still watching. One of them, an older man with white hair and a barrel chest, crossed his arms slowly. "Where have you worked?" she asked. "Circle R outside Amarillo for 4 years. Lazy S in the Panhandle for 3 years before that. I did 2 full drives up the Kisham, 1 to Abilene and 1 to Dodge. I can break horses, I can ride, I can rope, I can read cattle, and I can mend anything you put in front of me. Why are you not still at the Circle R?" Foreman retired and the new man brought his own crew in from Oklahoma. "You have been to other places in the valley first." It was not a question. He met her eyes. "5 of them, yesterday." She looked at him for a long moment. The spring wind moved through the juniper trees on the hillside, and Copper shifted his weight and blew out a breath. "You will do fine," she said, and she meant it. He could hear it in the flatness of the statement, the absence of any qualifying hesitation. Not "you seem like you might do," or "I suppose I could give you a chance." "You will do fine," as simple and certain as a statement about the weather. Something moved in Roy's chest that he did not immediately have a name for. Something that had been braced for another door closing now found itself in open air. "I am obliged to you," he said. "Do not be obliged yet. The pay is $1 a day and found, same as anywhere else, but I have to be honest with you, Mr. Hadley. This outfit is not in good shape right now. My husband passed 8 months ago and I have been holding this ranch together with whatever I can grab. The north fence is down in 3 places. The south pasture needs to be recut before the cattle can go back in. The barn needs a new roof section over the east stall, and I have a mare that has been favoring her left foreleg for 2 weeks and I cannot figure out why. Those are the immediate problems. There are others. Yes, ma'am, Roy said. He swung down from Copper's back and stood on the ground in front of her. She was only a few inches shorter than him. Where do you want me to start? She studied him for one more moment, and he had the sense that she was deciding something larger than whether to put him to work today. Come inside and I will pour you some coffee and we will talk about the order of things, she said. I am Rebecca, not ma'am. Ma'am makes me feel like someone's grandmother. He almost smiled. It had been a while since anything had almost made him smile. Yes, ma'am, he said, just once more, deliberately, and she gave him a look that was sharp and brief, and contained something that he thought might have been the beginning of amusement. The older white-haired man came over as Roy was tying Copper to the hitching rail. He had a face that had been weathered to the color and texture of old saddle leather, and he moved with the permanent slight hunch of a man who had spent decades doing heavy work. I am Ned Pollen, he said. Been with this outfit 8 years. The young man over there is Charlie Greer, been here about 2 years. He paused. He had blue eyes that were very direct. She is a good woman and she is working herself to nothing trying to keep this place. She does not need anybody giving her any trouble. I do not give trouble, Roy said. I take work where I can get it and I do it right. Ned Pollen looked at him the way a man looks at something he is deciding whether to trust. You might find it a straightforward enough arrangement here, he said. She does not ask about your face and she does not expect you to ask about her business. She just expects the work to be done and done properly. Those are fine terms, Roy said. He followed Rebecca Lawson into the stone house and sat at a kitchen table that was covered with papers, what looked like ledgers and bills of sale and notes in a small, tight handwriting. She moved the papers to make room for 2 cups and poured coffee from a pot that had been sitting on the stove. And it was strong coffee, the kind that had clearly been made by someone for whom coffee was fuel rather than pleasure. The kitchen was clean and practical. There were dried herbs hanging from the ceiling joists and a good iron stove, and a shelf of preserves along one wall. On another wall there was a framed photograph of a man who had to be George Lawson, a broad-shouldered man with a serious face who looked like someone who had built things with his hands and was proud of it. Roy did not stare at it, but he noticed it. Rebecca sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at him with those dark, practical eyes. Tell me what you know about horses, she said, specifically about leg injuries. More than most, he said. I had a foreman who believed that half of good ranching was keeping your horses sound. I watched him assess more lameness cases than I can count. What is the mare doing? She is not exactly lame. She walks all right and she trots all right on hard ground, but she flinches when I press along the inside of the lower leg and she has been off her grain some mornings. Has she been in soft ground recently? Marshy pasture? Rebecca looked at him with slightly increased attention. Yes. She was in the south pasture before I moved the stock. It was wet after the snow melt. Could be thrush that has worked up into the white line, or it could be the beginning of a splint. The soft ground would account for either. I can look at her after coffee if you want. I want, she said. They talked about horses for a while and then about the ranch. She described the land, the acreage, the number of cattle, the water situation. She spoke without any self-pity about what the last 8 months had been like, which Roy found he respected considerably. She was not asking for sympathy. She was briefing a new employee, and she did it with precision and economy. He learned things in that conversation that helped him understand the territory. The ranch had belonged to George Lawson's family for 14 years. George had died in January from a fever that had started in a minor infection and gone bad before anyone understood how serious it was. Rebecca and George had been married for 6 years. They had no children. She was 29 years old. He also learned, though she did not say so directly, that the pressure from Gerald Kessler to sell was real and ongoing. Kessler had sent his man, a fellow named Briggs, twice since George's death with offers that increased each time. Rebecca had declined both times. The manner in which she described this was so flat and so final that Roy understood there was no ambiguity in her position. She was not going to sell. She was going to find a way to hold this ranch together. After coffee, he went out to look at the mare. She was a gray, nicely built, 7 or 8 years old, and she stood quietly as he ran his hand down her left foreleg. She flinched when he pressed along the cannon bone, but not at the pastern, which told him something. He cleaned the frog of her left front hoof and found what he had suspected: dark, soft, foul-smelling tissue that indicated a thrush infection that had been developing for a while. "It is thrush," he said to Rebecca, who was standing at the stall door watching him work. "Not a splint, which is the better news. I can treat it. You want to pack the foot with a mixture of pine tar and copper sulfate if you have it, or even just pine tar alone. Keep her out of wet ground for 2 weeks and clean the hoof daily." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "The other places in the valley," she said carefully. "What did they say to you?" Roy kept his attention on the mare's hoof. "Most of them said they had a full crew." "And the ones who did not say that?" He looked up at her. She was watching him steadily. "Kessler said I would not make the right impression on his buyers from Kansas City." She absorbed this without visible reaction, but something shifted in her face. "Gerald Kessler is a man who has never done a difficult thing in his life that he could not pay someone else to do," she said, and the words were so controlled and precise that they were more effective than anger would have been. "You will set the mare's hoof treatment, and then I want you and Ned to ride the north fence line this afternoon. I need to know how bad the damage is before I can order supplies." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She was almost to the barn door when she stopped and looked back at him. "Rebecca," she said, "I did tell you already." "You did," he agreed. "I am still working on it." Something moved in her expression that was quick and unguarded and genuine. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. And then she went back to whatever she had been doing before he arrived, and Roy Hadley set about learning the geography of the Lawson Ranch. He rode the north fence with Ned that afternoon and took careful notes on 3 sections that needed new posts and wire. He learned from Ned, who talked comfortably on horseback the way old cowboys do, that Charlie Greer was reliable but young and still learning, that the ranch had owned 12 horses at its peak and was now down to 7, that the cattle herd had been about 200 head when George was alive and had drifted down to about 160, due to various sales Rebecca had made to cover costs, and that Gerald Kessler's man Briggs made Roy deeply uneasy in the particular way that well-dressed men who work for powerful men always made Ned uneasy. "She turned down $3,000 last month," Ned said. "Kessler thinks she just has not found her number yet. He does not understand that there is no number." "What is the land worth?" Roy asked. "The land plus the water rights, 5,000 easy, maybe more. Kessler knows exactly what he is offering and why." That evening Roy ate supper with Ned and Charlie in the bunkhouse, which was a small but serviceable building with 4 bunks, a wood stove, and a table. Charlie Greer was 22, from Missouri, with an open face and a habit of asking questions about everything with the earnest curiosity of someone who had not yet learned to hide their interest in the world. He looked at Roy's scar once and then, apparently having processed whatever he needed to process about it, never appeared to look at it again. "How long you been working cattle?" Charlie asked. 15 years, more or less." "What is the longest drive you ever did?" "Abilene Run in 1877, 93 days from the Red River. Lost 2 men and about 30 head to a river crossing that went wrong." Charlie asked about the crossing with the bright attention of someone hearing a story they wanted to remember, and Roy told it the way he told most things, plainly and without embellishment. And by the end of it, Charlie was nodding with the look of someone who has just learned something important. That was the first night of Roy Hadley at the Lawson Ranch. In the days that followed, he worked with the focused intensity of a man who understood that the best argument for his presence was the quality of his presence. He and Ned and Charlie began on the north fence, which was worse than it had looked on the initial ride, with 6 posts that needed replacing rather than 3, and a section where the wire had been torn loose from a heavy snowfall, and rolled back on itself in a tangle that took most of a morning to sort out. Roy worked steadily and without complaint, and he was faster than both Ned and Charlie with the wire stringing because he had done a great deal of it over the years and had the particular technique, the way of keeping tension consistent, that made the work go cleanly. Rebecca came out on the second morning to check progress and stood at the fence line watching them work for a while. She had a notebook in her hand that she made entries in, and she asked questions about the wire gauges and post depths with the attention of someone who was keeping a mental inventory of every resource on the property. Roy found himself noticing things about her that he did not entirely mean to notice. The way she moved, with a purpose and economy that suggested she was always thinking 3 tasks ahead. The way she listened, very still and complete, when someone was telling her something she needed to know. The way she talked to Copper when Roy brought the horse out in the mornings. A brief, soft exchange that Copper clearly appreciated because he always dropped his head slightly when she spoke to him. He also noticed, because he was observant by nature, that she was running on very little sleep. The lamp in the main house was burning past midnight most nights, visible from the bunkhouse across the yard. She was going through those ledgers and papers he had seen on the kitchen table, and whatever she was finding in them was not making those late nights any shorter. On the 6th day, he asked her about it directly, which surprised her. They were both in the barn in the early evening, he finishing up with Copper and she checking on the gray mare, whose hoof was already showing improvement with the daily treatment. "You are working nights on the accounts," he said. It was not quite a question. She looked at him over the mare's back. "Yes." "Is it bad?" She was quiet for a moment. He thought she might tell him it was none of his concern, which would have been entirely fair. Instead she said, "George managed the business accounts and I managed the house and helped with the cattle. When he died I inherited a system I did not fully understand. I have spent 8 months learning it from the inside." She paused. "There are some debts that I was not aware of." "How much?" She named a figure that was significant but not catastrophic. It was the kind of debt that could be resolved with a good sale in autumn and careful management through the summer. Roy looked at the mare and thought for a moment. "You have the summer drive to think about. If you can get your cattle to market in good condition, you can cover that and have something left over." "I know," she said. "I need to hire more hands first. Getting the herd in shape for a fall drive with 3 men is not workable. We can do it with 4 if we are smart about it." She looked at him with those dark, direct eyes. "You have done a fall drive short-handed before, done a spring drive short-handed, lost 3 men to a cholera scare and finished with 4. It is harder work and longer hours, but it is possible." She considered this. "You would still be here in the fall?" She asked, and there was something very careful in the way she asked it, as if she were trying to determine the shape of a thing without touching it directly. "I do not have anywhere else to be," he said. It came out more plainly than he had intended, carrying more truth than the question had perhaps asked for. She nodded once and went back to the mare's hoof, and Roy finished with Copper, and neither of them said anything else about it, but something had been said nonetheless. The days lengthened into summer and the work was hard and constant, but the ranch began to respond to it the way good land responds to attention, perking up, showing its better qualities, like a horse that has been well trained finally having the chance to demonstrate what it knows. The fences were repaired. The south pasture was recut and the cattle brought back to it. The barn roof section got a new set of boards and 2 new rafters, a job that Roy and Charlie managed together over 2 very long days, and that Roy had not quite admitted to Rebecca he had never done before, though he understood the principles of it thoroughly enough that the not having done it had not mattered. He found a 4th hand in town, a man named Felix Ortega who was 35 and had worked cattle most of his adult life, and who came recommended by Ned, who had worked alongside him on a previous outfit. Felix was a careful, quiet man who moved efficiently and spoke only when he had something worth saying, qualities Roy had come to appreciate deeply over 15 years of working alongside men who had neither. Rebecca paid Felix $1 a day and found the same as the others and shook his hand in the yard and said, "I expect good work and I pay for it, and if there is ever a problem you come to me directly." Felix nodded and said, "Yes, Mrs. Lawson," and that was that. It was the third week of June when Gerald Kessler came himself. Roy was working near the barn when he saw the two riders coming up the track from the south, and he recognized Kessler by the silver hair and the prosperous cut of his coat, and the man beside him was the one Ned had described as Briggs, a heavy-set man with a short beard and a way of looking at things that suggested he was always calculating their value. Rebecca came out of the house as they rode into the yard. She must have seen them from the window. She stood on the porch with her arms at her sides, not crossed, not raised, just at her sides, and the very stillness of her posture said everything. Roy kept working, but he did not move far from where he could hear. "Mrs. Lawson," Kessler said, tipping his hat with that particular courtesy that well-practiced powerful men have, the kind that looks like respect but functions as pressure. "You are looking well." "Thank you," she said. "I imagine you have not ridden 6 miles to tell me that." Kessler smiled in the way that men smile when they have rehearsed the smile. "I have come with an updated offer. I think you will find it reflects my sincere appreciation for what your husband built here." "Mr. Kessler," Rebecca said, and her voice was very clear and very even, like water in a glass. "I have told your man Briggs twice that I am not interested in selling. I am telling you directly now because perhaps it carries more weight coming from me rather than coming back to me. I'm not selling this ranch. Not for your current offer, not for a higher one." Kessler's smile did not entirely disappear, but it adjusted itself. "I understand your sentiment, but you are a practical woman, Mrs. Lawson, and the practical truth is that running this operation alone, with a reduced crew and outstanding debts, is a very steep hill for any person to climb." Roy had set down his tools. He was not approaching the porch, but he was standing where he was visible. "I am not alone," Rebecca said, "and the hill is being climbed. Good day, Mr. Kessler." Kessler looked at Roy for a moment with recognition and something that might have been a flicker of surprise. Then he looked back at Rebecca. "The offer stands," he said. "Take whatever time you need." He turned his horse and Briggs turned with him and they rode back down the track. Rebecca stood on the porch until they were out of sight. Then she took a breath, very deliberate, and looked at Roy. "Thank you for being visible," she said. "I was not doing anything," he said. "You were being present," she said. "It helps." He nodded once and went back to his work. But later, when he was alone and the day had wound itself down and the stars were out over the valley, he thought about what she had said. "You were being present. It helps." He turned it over in his mind the way you turn a stone over in your hand, feeling its weight and texture. He had not been present in anyone's life in a significant way in a very long time. He had been useful often. He had been competent consistently. But present was different. Present meant that someone was aware of you as a specific person rather than a function, and that they found the awareness worthwhile. He was not sure when he had last been that. There was an evening in early July when he and Rebecca sat on the porch steps because the house was too warm from the day's heat, and the porch caught the evening breeze that came down from the hills. Ned and the other men were in the bunkhouse. The night was deep blue and full of stars, and the creek made its constant, quiet sound in the distance. They had not planned to sit together. He had come out to check on a young horse that had been restless, found nothing wrong, and was heading back when she came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and simply handed him one as if it had been agreed upon, and he had sat down on the steps because that seemed to be what was being offered. They talked easily that evening, the way that people talk when they have been working alongside each other long enough to have established a common language. She told him about her life before the ranch, that she had grown up in Missouri, that her father had been a school teacher, that she had come west at 21 to work as a teacher in Mercy Creek, and had met George Lawson at a church social 3 weeks after arriving. She talked about George without her voice breaking, which Roy respected. Not because she had stopped loving him, he could tell that she had not, but because she had found a way to carry that love in the present tense that did not require falling apart every time she reached for it. He told her about Texas and the drives. He did not tell her about the branding iron, not that night, but he told her about the vaquero named Esteban without giving all the context, and she listened with that complete stillness she had, and when he was done she said, "You stood between him and a man with power." "Yes." "Was it the right thing?" "Yes," he said, without any deliberation. She looked at him with those dark eyes in the starlight. "Then I do not know why you would carry it as anything other than that," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The night moved around them, warm and vast and fragrant with sage and cedar. "The world decided to carry it for me," he said. She understood what he meant. He could see it in the slight change in her expression, not pity, never pity, but a clear-eyed acknowledgement of the thing he was describing. "The world is often wrong about what a face means," she said. "You were not," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said, "I was not." She said it simply, the same way she said most things, and yet the simplicity of it landed on him with more weight than any elaborate statement could have managed. He did not say anything more about it. Neither did she. They finished their coffee and she went inside and he walked back to the bunkhouse and lay in his bunk and looked at the ceiling and felt something in his chest that was warm and complicated and entirely new in his experience of himself. The summer deepened and the work was good. The cattle were fattening on the recut south pasture grass and the summer range in the hills. The mare recovered fully from the thrush. Roy found 2 additional horses that needed attention, one with an abscess and one with a cracked hoof wall, and dealt with both of them with the same methodical competence he brought to everything. The north fence held through a July storm that brought more wind than the valley usually saw, and Roy spent the morning after riding the line looking for damage, and found only 2 posts that needed resetting. He was aware, as the weeks went by, that something was developing between him and Rebecca that he did not have an entirely comfortable name for. It was not a dramatic thing. It was not the kind of sudden electricity that songs and stories made it out to be. It was quieter and more persistent than that, a steady accretion of small things. The coffee on the porch steps, which had become a regular occurrence on evenings when the heat of the day lingered. The way she would sometimes ride out with him when he was checking the upper range, not because she needed to, but apparently because she wanted to. The way their conversations had deepened without either of them particularly directing that deepening, moving from the practical logistics of the ranch to the deeper things, the histories and the losses and the beliefs that people carry under their working lives. He learned that she was religious in a way that was private and thoughtful rather than performative, that she prayed in the morning before the day started, and that her faith was a source of genuine strength rather than a social obligation. He learned that she loved to read and had a collection of books on a shelf in the sitting room that she had carried from Missouri on the wagon that had brought her west, and that she had read each of them more than once. He learned that she had a way with the cattle that was instinctive, a particular patience and steadiness around them, that the animals responded to in the way that animals always respond to people who are not nervous. She learned things about him too. He could see the learning happening in the same quiet, incremental way, in the questions she asked, in the things she noticed. She noticed that he could predict weather with a reliability that was uncanny, reading sky and wind and the behavior of the horses. She noticed that he was the first person up in the mornings and the last one done at night, not out of any anxious energy, but out of a deep and apparently habitual commitment to the work being finished properly. She noticed that he was kinder to the horses than anyone she had ever seen on a ranch, not in a soft way, but in the way of someone who understood horses as individuals rather than tools. On a day in early August, she asked him about the branding iron. They were out on the East Ridge where the summer range was at its best, watching the cattle move through the long grass in the afternoon light, and she asked it directly in the way she asked most things, not circling around it but going straight to it. "What happened," she said, "with the branding iron, the whole of it? he told her. All of it this time. Dorset and Esteban and the wages, and the iron and the scar and his walking papers, and the 9 years since. He told it plainly, without self-pity or dramatization, the way he had told her about the drive and the river crossing, and she listened in that completely present way she had that made you feel the telling was worth the effort. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, looking out at the cattle. "Esteban," she said, "did he get paid?" "I do not know," Roy said. "I hope so. Last I saw him he was running." "You paid for it," she said. "He would have paid more," Roy said. She turned to look at him then, and the afternoon light was on her face, and her dark eyes were very serious and very warm at the same time, a combination that he found he could not easily look away from. "You are a good man, Roy Hadley," she said. "I want you to know that I see that." It was the kind of statement that if anyone else had made it would have sounded presumptuous or patronizing, but Rebecca Lawson made it sound like fact, like a neutral observation about the state of the world, because that was how she operated. She stated what she observed. She did not traffic in flattery. He felt something open up in his chest that had been closed for a very long time. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was quieter than he intended. She held his gaze for a moment longer and then looked back at the cattle, and neither of them said anything else about it. But the afternoon had shifted somehow, had taken on a quality that the morning had not had. Things moved forward in the way that honest things move forward, slowly and without much ceremony. There was an evening in mid-August when she stumbled coming down the porch steps because the light was low and she misjudged the distance to the ground. And he was right there and caught her arm before she could fall, and the catching was immediate and natural, and then they were standing very close together in the lamplight from the doorway, and she looked up at him, and neither of them moved for a moment that stretched longer than moments usually do. "Thank you," she said. "The bottom step," he said. "It needs to be rehung." "The board is loose," she almost laughed. The almost laugh broke the moment in a way that felt right, that felt like the moment had done what it needed to do and could now release them back to the ordinary world. He fixed the step the next morning, first thing. It was in September that Gerald Kessler's operation became something more pointed than polite pressure. Roy was in the barn when Charlie came running from the south field, out of breath and wide-eyed, saying that there were men he did not recognize pulling out the section of the south fence that ran along the property boundary with Kessler's land. 3 men, good horses, and they were not being quiet or subtle about it. Roy went to find Rebecca. She was in the house with the ledgers and she came out immediately pulling on her hat. "How many?" she said. "3, Roy said. "Charlie says they have tools. They are taking the posts, not just the wire." Her jaw was set and her dark eyes were flat and furious. "That is our fence and our property." "Yes," Roy said. "You should let me and Ned and Felix go down there first. Let us find out what they are doing before you go in." She looked at him. He knew she was deciding whether to accept this, and he also knew that her instinct was to go herself because this was her land and her fight. He held her gaze and waited. "Fine," she said, "but I am right behind you." The 3 men at the fence were hired workers, not Kessler himself or Briggs. They had been told, they said when confronted, that the boundary line was being corrected and that the fence had been improperly placed. They had papers they said proved this. Roy looked at the papers, which were well-produced and confident-looking, and then looked at Ned, who was old enough and experienced enough to know that well-produced, confident-looking papers are sometimes genuine and sometimes theater. "Step back," Roy said to the 3 men, and they stepped back because he said it in a way that communicated clearly that this was not a request, and because Ned and Felix were flanking him and Charlie had appeared behind them. Rebecca rode up while they were still stopped. She looked at the papers and her expression did not change in any visible way, which Roy had come to understand meant she was very angry. "These papers reference a survey dated 1879, she said. "My husband had this land resurveyed in 1881. The survey records are in Mercy Creek at the county office. This fence is on the correct boundary." The 3 men looked at each other. They had been told something that was apparently not entirely what they were now being told, and they were the kind of men who had been paid to do a job, and were now finding themselves in a situation that was more complicated than the job had been described as being. "You are going to ride back to wherever Kessler sent you from," Rebecca said, "and you are going to tell him that the next men he sends onto my land unannounced will find the county sheriff here when they arrive, because I will have him here. And that I am going to the county office tomorrow to register a formal complaint about this survey claim." The three men went. Roy rode back with Rebecca and the hands, and at the gate of the ranch yard she turned her horse and looked at the crew, all four of them, and said simply, "Thank you," and went inside. Roy stayed in the yard for a moment. Ned came to stand beside him. "She is going to have to fight him in a real way before this is done," Ned said quietly. "Yes," Roy said, "but she knows that. Do you think she can win?" Roy looked at the house, at the light in the window, at the strong, honest stone walls that George Lawson had built and Rebecca Lawson was keeping. "Yes," he said, "I think she has enough fight in her." He went to the county office in Mercy Creek the next morning with Rebecca, and they found the 1881 survey records exactly where she said they would be. And the county clerk, a small methodical man named Dawes, confirmed that the boundary was as the 1881 survey showed it to be, and that any conflicting claim would need to go before a judge. They rode back in the crisp September morning, side by side on the road through the valley, and Roy thought about the fact that 2 months ago he had ridden into this valley not knowing a single person in it and had been turned away from every door he knocked on, and now he was riding this road beside a woman who had not turned him away, and the valley that had been a landscape of closed doors was now something else entirely. He did not say this out loud, but he felt it. "Kessler is not done," Rebecca said as they rode. "No," Roy agreed, "but you have documentation and you have people who will stand with you. That changes the arithmetic." She glanced at him. The morning light was very clear, and it caught the planes of her face, the strong cheekbones, the dark eyes. "Is that what it is?" she said. "Arithmetic." "In part," he said. "And in the other part?" He considered the question. They were riding through a stretch of the road where the juniper trees came close on either side and the light came through them in long slanted bars. "In the other part," he said carefully, "it is about what people decide matters enough to stand for." She was quiet for a moment, listening to the horses' hoofbeats on the packed earth road. "What matters enough to you to stand for?" she asked. He thought of Esteban and the iron and 9 years of carrying his face into rooms that did not want to see it. He thought of the 5 ranches in this valley that had looked at him and seen a problem. He thought of a woman who had come out of a barn with a pitchfork and looked at him with dark practical eyes and said, "You will do fine." "What is right," he said, "and what I care about." The silence between them after that had a different quality than the silences before, fuller and more deliberate. And she did not look at him directly, but he was aware that she was aware of what he had just said, and what it meant, and that she was considering it. She had been considering something for a while now. He had been aware of that too. September turned. The cattle were in fine shape, fat and healthy from the summer pasture, and the plan for the fall drive had been taking shape through weeks of practical discussion. Roy had laid it out carefully: the route, the timing, the division of responsibilities, the expected price at the railhead market in Santa Fe where they had decided to sell rather than the longer drive north. 4 men and 150 head was manageable on that route. Hard but manageable. Rebecca had decided to come on the drive herself. Roy had not argued with this decision, because he understood that it was not the kind of decision that was his to argue with. It was her cattle and her land and her future, and she had every right to see the drive through personally. He had simply made sure that she had a good horse for the journey, and that everyone understood the daily order of things. She was a capable rider, and she was good with cattle. He had known this from watching her on the ranch, but he had not fully understood until they were 3 days into the drive how very good she was. She had an instinct for where the herd was tending, could read the movement of cattle at the edges of a group and anticipate what they were going to do before they did it, and she worked the flank with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything else. They drove by day and camped by night, the 5 of them and the herd and the spare horses. The nights were cold in late September, and they built their fires large and sat close to them after the day's work was done, and the talk was easy and good-humored in the way of trail camps. One night 4 days out, Roy took the last watch before dawn, which was always the quietest and coldest part of the night, and he was riding slow circles around the resting herd when he heard someone come up behind him and turned to see Rebecca on her gray mare, wrapped in a blanket coat, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. "You should be sleeping," he said. "I could not sleep," she said. "I do not mind the watch." She fell in beside him, and they rode the perimeter in silence for a while. The cattle were settled and still, shapes in the dark, their breathing a low collective sound. Above them the sky was extravagantly full of stars. "Roy," she said after a while. "Yes." She was quiet for another moment, and he could feel her gathering herself to say something which was unusual enough that it made him very attentive. Rebecca Lawson rarely had to gather herself. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want to tell it plainly because I do not know another way to tell things." "All right," he said. "When you rode up that first morning," she said, "I had been considering for some weeks whether I could hold on. Not the ranch I knew I could hold on to. But the larger holding on, the continuing to believe that things could be good." She paused. "George's death was very hard, not just the loss of him but the sudden aloneness of everything. Making every decision alone, every fear alone." He did not say anything, he listened. "And then you rode in," she said, "and I looked at you and I thought, here is a person who knows something about being alone in a particular way. And I thought you would be a good worker, which you are, but I did not expect—" She stopped. "You did not expect what?" he asked carefully. "That I would come to feel less alone," she said, "specifically because of you." The horses moved beneath them. The herd breathed. The stars were very present in the cold, clear sky. "Rebecca," he said. "I know you did not come here for anything of that nature," she said, and her voice was very steady, though he could hear something underneath the steadiness. "You came here for work and I gave you work, and that is what we have agreed to. I am not saying any of this to create an obligation or a difficulty. I am saying it because I think honesty is better than the alternative and because I trust you with it." "Stop," he said gently. She stopped. He pulled Copper to a halt and looked at her, and she pulled her mare to a halt and looked back at him, and in the starlight her face was very clear and very honest and very near. "I am going to tell you something plainly as well," he said. "Because you have told me that is the way you prefer to receive things." She nodded once. "I rode into this valley with nothing and was turned away from every door I came to," he said. "And then I came to yours and you looked at me and said I would do fine. And in the months since then I have understood more every week that you are the best person I have encountered in my life. Not the kindest, though you are kind. Not the bravest, though you are that too. The best, in the way that something can be fundamentally good all the way through, without any of the hollowness that most things have in the middle." She was very still. "I did not intend to feel what I feel," he said. "But I do not regret it. I would not trade it for anything I have been offered before or since." "What do you feel?" she asked, and her voice was quieter now. "That I love you," he said, "as plainly as I can say it." The word went out into the cold night air and hung there, and Rebecca Lawson looked at him with those dark eyes that had never flinched from looking at him directly, and then she closed the small distance between their horses and reached out and took his hand. Her hand was warm despite the cold air. He closed his fingers around it and held on. "I love you too," she said. "Since at least the evening you almost smiled at me for calling you ma'am." He did smile then, fully and completely, in a way he was not sure his face had ever quite managed, and she was smiling too, and the cattle breathed around them and the stars were immense overhead, and Roy Hadley understood with a kind of deep-settled certainty that something had changed completely, and for the better. They finished the watch together, riding side by side, and did not say much more because much more did not need to be said, and what had been said was enough to change the shape of the world they were both living in. The drive reached Santa Fe on the 9th day. The sale went well, better than Roy had projected in his most optimistic planning. The cattle were in excellent condition, and the buyer, a man who worked for a beef consortium that supplied to the mining camps in the territory, was direct and fair. Rebecca negotiated the price herself, and she was formidable at it, patient and precise, and without any of the eagerness that buyers look for to push a price down. When they shook hands, the figure was good enough that Roy saw her close her eyes briefly after the man had turned away, just for a second, in something that might have been relief or gratitude or both. On the road home, she told him the figure covered the debts and left a working reserve, and that she was going to use part of it to buy 2 additional horses in the spring. And a new roof section on the bunkhouse, Roy said. The east corner leaks. She looked at him with amusement that was warm and unguarded. The east corner of the bunkhouse, she said. It has been leaking since August, he said. I have been putting a bucket there. Roy Hadley, she said, and the way she said his name, the full name, had a particular quality to it that he was still getting used to, the way you are still getting used to a good thing even as you are already in it. Why did you not tell me about the roof? You had a great many things to attend to, he said. The roof was manageable. She shook her head slowly, but she was still smiling. You are going to have to stop managing things without telling me, she said. Even the small things. Yes, he said. All right. They rode home through the October hills, the 5 of them, lighter without the herd and easier with the work done. And Ned and Charlie and Felix rode ahead because they could tell, in the way that people who work alongside other people every day can tell, that Roy and Rebecca needed to be allowed to ride together at the back, which they did, side by side in the cooling fall air. He asked her, 3 miles out from Mercy Creek, in the late afternoon with the hills going gold around them and the smell of juniper in the air, if she would allow him to court her properly. She considered this with the precise seriousness she brought to everything. Properly, she said. What does that mean to you? It means openly, he said, with the intention of the thing being where we are both already understanding it to be going. She looked at him for a long moment. The light was amber and beautiful on her face. Yes, she said, I will allow that. The autumn passed in a way that was quietly joyful. The ranch was stable and improving. The immediate financial crisis had been resolved by the sale. Kessler's survey challenge had been formally rejected by the county judge in October, a ruling that came through on a Tuesday, and that Rebecca read aloud to the assembled crew at supper. And Ned responded by saying he had known the man was a fraud since the first time he had seen him, and everybody laughed. Kessler himself came one more time, in November, not Briggs but the man himself, on a cold gray afternoon when the first real snow was threatening from the north. He rode up alone this time, without the pomp and ceremony of his previous visit, and Roy was in the yard and watched him come and did not move away. Kessler got down from his horse and looked around the yard with those careful silver eyes. The ranch was in better shape than it had been in the spring, and the evidence of that was visible everywhere. The repaired fences, the painted barn door, the solid, well-maintained look of a place that had been worked hard and properly. Rebecca came out and stood on the porch. Kessler looked at her for a moment and then said something that Roy did not entirely expect. I came to tell you I am withdrawing my interest in this property, he said. The judge's ruling was clear, and my lawyer has advised me that further challenges would be expensive and unlikely to succeed. He paused. Your husband was a good man and he built something solid here. I believe I may have not conducted myself toward his widow with the respect that was warranted. I am telling you that plainly. Rebecca regarded him with a stillness that was complete. I appreciate the plain telling, she said. I hope we can be decent neighbors going forward. Kessler nodded. He looked briefly at Roy, and something in his expression was different from the expression he had worn in the spring when he had told Roy he would not make the right impression. Roy could not have named exactly what was different. Something that recognized it had been wrong. Then Kessler got back on his horse and rode south, and that was the last they saw of him in any adversarial capacity. Rebecca watched him go and then turned to Roy with an expression that was open and a little bit wondering. "That was not what I expected," she said. "No," Roy said. "It was better than expected." She came down off the porch and stood beside him, and they watched the distant figure of Kessler's horse disappearing toward the valley floor. The first snowflakes were beginning to fall, very light and scattered out of the gray sky. "It is going to snow," Rebecca said. "Yes," Roy said. "By morning there will be several inches." She looked up at the sky and then back at him, and the snowflakes were falling in her dark hair. And she looked so present and so real and so much like herself that it hit him with a force that he was still not entirely accustomed to. That this was his life now, or could be, if he asked and she said yes. He asked her on a Sunday in December, on the porch in the cold, clear air after the Sunday morning service at the Mercy Creek Church, which she attended every week, and which he had begun attending with her because being beside her was where he wanted to be. The congregation had seen them arrive together and had been drawing the appropriate and entirely correct conclusions for 2 months, and Roy had spoken to Reverend Albright the week before to ask about the practical arrangements, and the Reverend had been a warm and sensible man who had told him everything he needed to know and had added, unprompted, that he thought it was a fine thing. He had a ring. He had ridden to Santa Fe in November under the pretense of business, and had gone to a jeweler there, a careful old man who made jewelry with skill and intention, and had described what he wanted, and the old man had produced it. A simple band of gold with a small turquoise stone set in silver, because he had thought the combination was right for her, practical and beautiful, and carrying something of the landscape she had chosen for her life. On the porch in the December morning, he held the ring in his hand and looked at her and said, "Rebecca Lawson, I would like to spend my life with you. I would like to be your husband and work this land beside you and be the man you can rely on for whatever comes next. I am asking if you will marry me." She looked at the ring in his scarred hand, and then she looked at his face, all of it, the scar and the jaw and the eyes that were watching her with everything he was feeling visible in them, and she said, "Yes, Roy Hadley, I have been waiting for you to ask." He slid the ring onto her finger and she looked at it for a moment, and then she looked up at him, and he leaned down and kissed her for the first time, there on the porch in the December cold, and she kissed him back with a warmth that was entirely her, honest and warm and complete. They were married in February of 1884 at the Mercy Creek Church, on a day when the snow was clean and white on all the hills, and the sky was the deep winter blue that only cold, dry air produces. The church was full because Rebecca Lawson was well known in the town and well liked, and because the people of Mercy Creek had watched the Lawson Ranch stabilize and improve over the preceding months, and had drawn their own conclusions about the steady-handed man who had arrived from the South in spring. Ned stood up for Roy in the absence of any family. Roy had no family to speak of, no one close, and Ned had been the closest thing to a friend he had found in this place, and Ned had agreed with the particular gruff dignity of a man who takes such things seriously. Rebecca walked down the aisle in a blue dress that was the color of a summer sky, and she held her head with the particular uprightness that was entirely hers, and she looked at Roy the whole way down the aisle with those direct dark eyes. Reverend Albright read the words and they said the words back to him, and Roy slid a second ring onto Rebecca's finger, the wedding band he had also bought from the careful old jeweler in Santa Fe, to sit beside the engagement ring with the turquoise stone. When Reverend Albright said Roy could kiss his bride, Roy took Rebecca's face in both hands, gently and deliberately, and kissed her properly, and the congregation made the sound that congregations make at weddings when they are genuinely pleased and not just performing pleasure. Afterward there was a celebration at the church hall with food that half the town had contributed, and music from a fiddler named Harlan who played with more enthusiasm than precision, but managed to convey genuine joy through sheer volume of effort. Roy danced with his wife, which he had not done in many years and did not do particularly well, and Rebecca laughed, which was a sound he was still discovering the pleasure of, and they danced anyway. Ned danced with the postmistress, a widow named Mrs. Carmichael, who had been widowed about as long as Ned had been alone, and Charlie Greer danced with every unattached young woman in the room with the cheerful, indiscriminate enthusiasm of a 22-year-old, who is having the finest evening of his recent life. Felix Ortega sat with Reverend Albright and appeared to be having a long and serious conversation about something that neither of them minded the noise around them for. Roy and Rebecca Lawson, who was now Rebecca Hadley though she kept both names in the way of ranch business, rode home through the February night on a road lit by a full moon over snow, and the world was white and still, and the ranch house came into sight with the lamp burning warm in the front window, because Ned had gone ahead early to make sure it was lit. And Roy looked at the stone house and the barn and the hills behind them and felt something that was larger and quieter than happiness. That was more like the specific gravity of a life that has found its proper shape. They settled into the life of the ranch with the same steadiness and competence they brought to everything. Spring came and the work of the new season began, the checking of the winter-rested pastures, the assessment of the herd's condition after the cold months, the planning for the year ahead. Roy and Rebecca worked alongside each other and alongside Ned and Felix and Charlie in the way they had been doing since summer, but with the difference that comes from things being settled and right, a quality of ease and depth that the work had not quite had before. By the time the summer grass was coming up and the cattle were back on the south pasture, Rebecca was carrying their first child. She told him on a May evening on the porch steps where they had first sat together, the same steps he had eventually fixed the board on, and she said it plainly as she always said things, and Roy was quiet for a moment in which a great deal happened inside him very quickly. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I am also very pleased." "Then so am I," he said, and took her hand, and they sat together in the spring evening with the creek making its quiet sound and the stars coming out over the hills, and the particular silence of two people who have said everything important that needs to be said, and are now simply together in the saying of it. The summer was good, one of the best the valley had in years, with reliable rain and long warm days that brought the grass up thick and the cattle fat. The herd had grown through careful management to 180 head. Rebecca managed the accounts now with the same precision she managed everything, and the ranch was solvent and stable, and the kind of quiet, productive operation that good ranches are, the kind that do not make news but do make a life. She rode well into late summer, which Roy worried about more than she did, though he kept most of the worrying internal because she had made it clear, gently but completely, that she was not made of glass, and that managing her own health was something she was capable of. He let her manage it. He was simply present and attentive in the way that she had told him that first day, in a context that felt like 100 years ago, was what she needed. He was the one who rode to get the midwife, a woman named Hattie Pierce who lived in town and had delivered half the children born in Mercy Creek in the last decade. He rode hard through the October morning while Ned stayed at the house with Rebecca, and he brought Hattie Pierce back in under an hour, and then stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, while the birth happened inside the stone house, and the October day went about its business around him. The child was a boy. He heard his son cry from the yard, that first sharp, clear cry that a baby produces as if announcing its own existence to the world. And Roy Hadley, who had spent most of his adult life being solid and steady and not easily moved, stood in his yard in the October sun and felt something so enormous move through him that he had to press his hand against his eyes for a moment. Ned stood nearby and said nothing, for which Roy was grateful. When Hattie Pierce came to the door and called him in, he went through the house to where Rebecca was in their bed, pale and tired and brilliant-eyed and holding a small wrapped bundle, and she looked up at him with those dark eyes that he had spent a year and a half learning and said, "Come and meet your son." He sat beside her, and she put the baby into his arms, and Roy looked down at his son's face, very small and very new and entirely serious, with the newborn's characteristic expression of someone who has just arrived somewhere and is still taking inventory of the situation. "George," Rebecca said. "I would like to call him George, after his grandfather and after my husband." She paused. "If that is all right with you." "George," Roy said, and the name sat right in his mouth. "George Hadley, that is a name with some weight to it. He will grow into it," she said. "He will," Roy agreed, and looked at his wife and his son, and the stone walls of the house that George Lawson had built, and that Rebecca Lawson had kept, and that they were together keeping still, and felt the specific and unrepeatable satisfaction of a life that has arrived where it was supposed to be. The years that followed were full. Not full in the breathless, frantic sense, but full in the substantive sense, each year carrying its proper weight of work and weather, and the small daily events that accumulate into a life. George Hadley grew from a serious newborn into a curious and vigorous small boy who had his mother's dark eyes and his father's steadiness, and who spent most of his early years following one or the other of his parents around the ranch, with the absorbed attention of someone in training for a position he had already decided he wanted. Roy taught him the horses first. This was deliberate. He believed, as his own best foreman had believed, that understanding horses was the foundation of everything else in ranch work. And so from the time George could walk safely in the barn, Roy brought him in to be near the animals, to learn their language, to understand what they were saying with their ears and their eyes, and the set of their shoulders. Rebecca taught him reading and numbers at the kitchen table. She had not been a schoolteacher for nothing, and she brought the same focused precision to George's education that she brought to everything, patient and methodical and genuinely interested in what he was learning and how he was learning it. In 1886, Rebecca told Roy she was expecting again. And this time she said it in the morning before the day started with a smile that was different from her usual smiles, wider and less contained, and Roy picked her up off her feet, which surprised them both, and she laughed that laugh that he was still discovering new qualities in. That second child was a girl, born in the autumn with a great deal more energy and noise than her brother had brought to his arrival, announcing herself to the entire ranch in a voice that suggested she had opinions and intended to share them. They named her Clara, after Rebecca's mother, and Clara was from the first moments of her existence a person with a very clear sense of what she wanted and a complete willingness to pursue it at volume. George met his sister with the profound solemnity of a 3-year-old who has just had the nature of his world changed significantly, looked at her for a long time, and then told his father that she was very loud and he would like to name her something different. Roy managed to maintain a straight face through this, which he considered one of his more significant adult achievements. The ranch continued to grow. Charlie Greer left in 1886 to start a small outfit of his own in the next valley over, which Roy and Rebecca saw him off to with genuine good wishes and the knowledge that he was ready for it. Felix Ortega stayed, became the foreman in all but formal title, a steady, reliable presence who knew the land and the cattle as well as Roy did. Ned worked until 1887, when a bad winter did damage to his joints that never entirely recovered, and he retired to a room in town that Roy and Rebecca helped him secure, with a visit from the ranch every Sunday that became a firm and pleasant fixture of the week. Roy watched the valley change in those years because the frontier was changing rapidly in the early years of the final decade of the century, the world pressing its organized modernity steadily westward, and the open range that had defined cattle culture for decades was giving way to fenced pastures and railroad access and market structures that demanded different kinds of thinking. He and Rebecca adapted to these changes together, as they adapted to everything, with practical intelligence and without nostalgia for the way things had been. He thought sometimes about the man he had been when he rode into this valley in the spring of 1883, with his worn saddle and his bay horse and his scar, and his careful management of his own hopes. He thought about those 5 doors in the valley that had looked at his face and said no, and about the track that wound up into the hills to the north, and the woman who had come out of a barn with a pitchfork and seen him clearly. He had thought then, or begun to think, that the world had decided what he was worth based on the evidence of his face, and that the decision was largely final. He had not quite stopped believing that when he rode up that track, but he had been willing to try one more door. One more door. That was all it had taken. One woman who looked at what was real rather than what was apparent. One woman who said you will do fine and meant it. Rebecca Hadley, sorting through accounts at the kitchen table one evening in the fall of 1888, looked up and found her husband watching her from the doorway with an expression she had learned to read as the one he wore when he was feeling something large and was finding his way to the words for it. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That you changed my life," he said. She set down her pen. "You changed mine as well," she said, "considerably." "I know," he said. "I am glad of that." She looked at him across the lamplit room, this man she had chosen and been chosen by, with the scar along his jaw and the steady gray eyes and the 15 years of honest hard work written in his hands, and she felt the particular satisfaction of knowing that you have built something true. "Come and help me with this column of figures," she said. "I have made an error somewhere and I cannot find it." He came to the table and sat beside her and looked at the numbers, and within a few minutes found the transposition error she had made in the 3rd column, and she said something quietly uncharitable about her own arithmetic, and he almost smiled, and she did smile, and George appeared in the doorway wanting water before bed, and Clara began crying from the next room because she had heard George was getting water, and she wanted some too. And the lamp burned warm on the table, and the accounts were sorted, and the ranch was quiet around them under the vast and star-filled western sky. 2 years later, in the spring of 1890, Rebecca told Roy over breakfast that she was expecting a 3rd child. George was 6 and Clara was 3, and the announcement was received at the breakfast table with a chaos of questions from George and incomprehension from Clara that resolved itself eventually into George explaining to Clara what was going to happen with the authority of someone who has had the concept previously explained to him and feels qualified to pass it along. "Will it be a brother?" George asked his father. "No way to know," Roy said. "I want a brother," George said. "Clara does not do anything useful." Clara threw a piece of biscuit at him. Roy looked at Rebecca over the heads of their children, and she looked back at him with the particular expression she had developed for moments when their offspring were being simultaneously impossible and entirely themselves, and it was the expression of someone who would not trade the impossibility for anything. The 3rd child was another boy, born in the autumn with the same dark eyes as his mother and a calm disposition that distinguished him from the first moment from the energetic household he had arrived into. They named him William, and he was from early on a thoughtful and observant child who seemed to be quietly taking stock of the world he had been placed in with the seriousness of someone who intended to learn it thoroughly before making any commitments. The summer of 1891 brought a drought to the valley, the first serious one in a decade, and it was hard on the ranches throughout the territory. Roy and Rebecca had planned for it as well as anyone could, having read the preceding winter's snowpack with the weather-reading attention that Roy had been applying to the sky for 20 years, and they sold off a portion of the herd in early summer at a good price before the market softened, and they had a winter hay reserve that other outfits did not have, and they came through the drought year in harder shape than the year before it, but in better shape than most. They helped where they could. Felix's cousin, who ran a small operation 20 miles east, lost his hay to the drought, and Roy and Rebecca sent a portion of their reserve to him in September without being asked, because it was the right thing, and because they had learned, separately and together over years of difficulty and recovery, that the right thing done consistently is what makes a life worth the living of it. Kessler's big ranch sold in 1892 to a beef consortium out of Kansas City, a fact that the valley received with a range of reactions from those who had dealt with Kessler over the years, and came out variously relieved or concerned about what corporate ownership would mean for the character of the place. Roy and Rebecca watched the change with attention and navigated the new neighbors with the same practical intelligence they brought to everything, finding what was workable and managing what was not. On a day in the autumn of 1892, Roy Hadley was mending fence on the eastern boundary of the ranch, the same eastern boundary that Kessler's men had tried to take down 9 years before, when he heard a horse coming and looked up to see Rebecca riding out to him on the gray mare, who was ancient now, and moved with the careful dignity of a horse that knows its own worth. She was carrying a basket. She got down from the mare and tied her to a fence post and brought the basket over to where Roy was working. "Lunch," she said. He set down his tools and they sat in the autumn grass and ate, and the valley spread below them in the long afternoon light, gold and brown and green, with the smoke from the ranch house visible in the distance and the hills rising behind it. The 3 children were in the house with Felix's wife, Maria, who had become a central and beloved figure in the household and whose opinion on domestic matters was law. "Do you ever think about Amarillo?" Rebecca asked. "Sometimes," Roy said. "Less and less." "Do you miss it?" He looked at the valley. "I did not have anything in Amarillo to miss," he said. "I had a job. This is different." She leaned her shoulder against his. He was aware of the familiar warmth of her beside him, the scent of her hair, the particular quality of the silence that had existed between them for 9 years now, a silence that was full rather than empty. "I think about that first morning sometimes," she said. "When you rode in. What do you think about it?" "I think about what I would have done if you had not come," she said. "How long I could have held on with 2 men and a failing outfit and debts I did not fully understand." "You would have found a way," he said. "Maybe," she said. "But it would have been a much harder way and a lonelier one." She paused. "I am glad you came to this valley." "I was turned away from it 6 ways before you," he said. "I nearly did not try the one more time." "But you did," she said. "I did," he said. She took his hand, the one with the calluses from 15 years of fence wire and rope and the work that did not end, and held it in both of hers. The scar on his face had not changed in 9 years. It would never change. It was as permanent as the stone walls of the house he had come to think of as home. But the weight of it had changed entirely, because the weight of a thing is not in the thing itself, but in how the world receives it, and the world he lived in now received his face with the same flat-footed honesty with which Rebecca Lawson had received it on the first morning. "Your face is your face. You will do fine. Here is the work." He looked at the valley, his valley now in the way that things become yours through years of tending and caring for them, and he thought about a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883, and a bay horse named Copper, and a worn saddle, and a road leading north into the hills where the junipers grew, and the air smelled of cedar and water. He thought about what it meant that one door had been open when all the others were closed. One person who looked and saw rather than looked and flinched. One woman with dark eyes and a pitchfork, and a way of saying things that left no room for misunderstanding. The autumn afternoon went warm and golden around them, and the mare stood quietly at the fence, and the children were laughing at something in the distant house, the sound carrying clearly in the still air, and Rebecca's hands were warm around his. "Come on," she said, standing up and brushing the dry grass from her skirt. "The fence will not finish itself, and I need you back before dark to help with the horses." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She gave him the look that had been there since the first morning, sharp and brief and full of something warm. Then she handed him his tools and went back to the mare, and Roy Hadley went back to the fence, and the work continued as it always did, and the ranch breathed around them in the afternoon light, solid and real and entirely theirs. Felix found himself working alongside a good man he trusted completely, and a woman he respected more than almost anyone he had known, and the ranch became a place that people in the valley knew as a good outfit, not the largest or the most prosperous, but one of the most sound, the kind of place where the work was done properly, and the people were treated fairly, and the animals were in good health, and the accounts were in order. Charlie Greer came to visit in the summer of 1892 with his own wife and 2 small children, and they sat on the porch of the stone house and ate supper outside in the summer evening, and told stories back and forth across the table. And Roy watched Rebecca laugh at something Charlie's wife said, and felt the deep particular pleasure of a life that has gathered good people into it and kept them. George Hadley at 8 years old was becoming a horseman of real instincts, able to read a horse's temperament before he got close enough to touch it, and Roy watched this with the quiet satisfaction of seeing something important passed forward. Clara was 6 and had the fierce intelligence and direct manner of her mother channeled through an even more forceful temperament, and Roy was honestly uncertain whether the valley was ready for her. William at 2 was still mostly engaged in the serious project of learning to walk across uneven ground without falling down, which he pursued with the same methodical determination with which he apparently planned to pursue everything else. On the last evening of 1892, the last day of the year, Roy and Rebecca sat on the porch steps as they had sat on so many evenings over the years, in the cold, clear air of New Year's Eve with the stars as large and bright as they always were over the open country, and the old year was going out quietly and the new one was coming in. "What do you want for next year?" she asked. He thought about it. The ranch was sound. The children were healthy. The people they relied on were good people. The fence was mended and the cattle were strong and the accounts were in order and the stone house was warm behind them with the lamp burning in the window. "This," he said, "exactly this." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The stars turned slowly overhead in their ancient patterns, the same stars that had looked down on the Cimarron Valley for 10,000 years before either of them arrived and would go on looking down long after, indifferent and magnificent, lighting the ground for whoever came to live on it. The creek made its sound in the dark. The horses were quiet in the barn. The children were asleep. The year turned over, and the new one came in clean and unmarked, and full of the particular possibility that every new year carries before the weight of its days has been added to it. Roy Hadley held his wife in the cold night and thought about roads and doors, and the vast geography of luck and choice that carries a person from one place to another without any guarantee of where it will end. He thought about a bay horse named Copper, and the track that wound through juniper trees to a hollow between 2 hills where a woman had come out of a barn door and looked at him clearly. He thought about the words she had said on that first morning with the flatness and certainty of a woman who stated facts and nothing else. "You will do fine." He pressed his lips to her hair very gently and looked out at the valley that was theirs in the darkness, and thought, with the whole of his settled and grateful heart, that she had been right.